the former feisty Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, whose record for sending MPs to the sin bin is second to none.
Mrs B.K. Bishop is declared elected.
I noticed that our roof is leaking.
Pensions
The member
are
for Griffith
sustainable.
will remove herself under
That our
94A.
Madam Speaker, you do recognise that is 100 people from this side of the House and no one from the other side of the House in the time you've been Speaker.
I would simply say to the manager of opposition business, if you had 100 members, you'd be in government and sitting on this side.
Well, no woman has served longer in our federal parliament than Bronwyn Bishop. 30 years, including a very colourful stint sending Labor MPs to the sin bin as Speaker of the House. Now, she's the carryover champion on the highly successful Paul Murray Live here at Sky News, but is still serving her community in so many ways. Bronwyn Bishop, an honour to have you on the program.
Great pleasure to join you, Chris. It's really terrific.
How are you coping with all of this lockdown and what you're required not to do and where you're required to be?
Well, I think it's very frustrating. I think that we were told in the beginning that we only had to flatten the curve so that people were able, our hospitals were able to deal with the people who caught the virus. And then suddenly we keep moving the goalposts. And there are some people, I think, who want to eradicate it, which is just not possible if we're ever going to integrate with the world again, because it's not going to go away. And I think people are getting very frustrated because they want to have a path forward that comes from the federal government telling us how we're going to get out of this situation. But so many of the things are governed by state governments, whether it's hospitals or going back to school, or whether you can go to the theatre or whether you can go to a cafe. And I think if it is kept on too long, and I think people are feeling that doctors are dictating, whereas we elect politicians to make decisions, you take advice but then you make a decision, that you'll get civil unrest. And that's why I've said that the federal government needs to make bold statements about what we're going to do, because we can't go back to where we were.
Yeah, this is very interesting, especially in terms of your experience as a leader. Here we had Steve Marshall, the South Australian Premier, talking about the fact that, well, I will wait for my Chief Medical Officer to decide when we reopen parts of the state. They haven't had a single infection for something like 2.5 weeks.
That's exactly the point. And I just think that, you know, when you're elected to a position, when I was a minister, if you had to make a decision, you took advice, but you had to make the decision, and you had to stand by that decision. So you can't say, I'll wait for somebody else to tell me what to do. Otherwise, you're not doing what you're elected to do.
Yeah, and I like the construct of a national cabinet, and I've heard your comments about that as well. But as we've gone on, it seems as if the premiers just snubbed their nose at the construct of a national cabinet.
Well, I think one of the worst things I heard was when Premier Palaszczuk, in talking to her Labor troops, said, oh, well, we can't let people out too soon because if something goes wrong, they'll blame us, not the federal government. Yes. How pathetic is that? Oh. Anyone who thinks that way does not deserve to be a Premier. And it's no good hiding behind, as I said so many times, no good hiding behind, oh, we're taking advice, because at the end of the day, you have to make the decision.
Yeah. We'll come back to this a little bit later in the show, but you have one of the most amazing records as Speaker of the House, and I understand fully, as most people who watch politics do as well, that the opposition are the ones who play up in question time, so normally you'd have many more opposition MPs thrown out of the House, but your record was 7 coalition MPs and you turfed 393 Labor MPs.
Oh, well, it might have sounded like a big number, but in fact there weren't very many of Labor MPs there because there'd been a big victory for the government. And there were really a lot of new people there who were being very good. But the people who got thrown out, I think you'll find they were about the same 10 people all the time. And if I might say, perhaps one of the most amusing times was the first Labor person I ever threw out, and that was Nick Champion, a member for Spence. And he was the first to go out for disorderly conduct under 94A. And I remembered that 2 or 3 years before, I'd been strapped into a helicopter next to him, a Black Hawk helicopter, up in East Timor with the doors wide open, and he was saying that I wanted to throw him out because then the government would change because Gillard wouldn't have the numbers on the floor of the House. Well, it was quite funny that I got him. He was the first person to throw out, and believe me, he was the one that got thrown out most. But, you know, I'm still involved with helicopters. This time it's a helicopter drone, which is about the size of a small car. It can stay in the air for 7 hours. It can fight bushfires fantastically. It could go into areas which are dangerous or impossible for human beings, and it's not made in China.
It's not made in China. But what wonderful technology, given how many bushfires we have in this country.
That's exactly right. And that's why I'm so pleased to be able to talk about it and talk to people about it, and hopefully we might take it up and use it in this country, because bushfires are always a factor in Australia. They have been before white settlement. They always have been. Fire has been a dominant part of the landscape.
Very, very true. Let's play a little bit of you in action and kicking out one of the 393 Labor MPs.
Times
the member for Greenway will leave under 94A. The members for Batman, Corio will leave under 94A. There will be silence. The member for Hotham will leave under 94A. The member will resume his seat and leave under 94A. The member will resume his seat and leave under 94A. Was that the member for Melbourne Ports? Well, in that case, you may leave under 94A. The member for Shorten will leave under 94A. The member will resume his seat, and indeed, having sat down, she too will leave under 94A, sequentially. The member for Moreton will leave under 94A.
At risk of adding to the total, I should note that 18 people in one question time is an all-time record since Federation.
18 in one question time. Did you enjoy that role as Speaker?
Yes, I did, very much, because it epitomises the strength of the robustness of debate in this country. It's not a mollycoddling chamber, the House of Representatives, and Tony Burke was running a good campaign that day, wasn't he? I mean, it looked good for him to have people misbehaving and having to be removed. But the width of that table in the House of Representatives is the width of 2 sabres. And that's very emblematic, because it means we've replaced the sword and the guns and the knuckles and the fistfights with words.
Very true. Why don't they behave in question time, Bronwyn?
Well, they want to get noticed. That's the first thing. They want to make life difficult for the government. They like to act up. And if you take a look at the people that the current Speaker throws out, you'll find many of the same names as the ones I used to throw out.
I think it's true that when it comes to question time, there are those who have to muscle up. They're the ones who lead the charge, and they almost sacrifice themselves to make their point, don't they?
That's exactly right. And one or two of them used to use a ploy, because if they got thrown out, it meant on a Thursday they could get an early plane home.
Do you really think that that was deliberate?
Absolutely.
Well, they can jump on the early plane and don't have to wait for seats. I don't know where we're going in terms of the respect that has been lost for politicians, though, Bronwyn, because I remember as a kid, gee, when the politician arrived at school or to a community event, it was roll out the red carpet. The respect was high. And we've lost all of that. Why have we lost all of that? Is that such a bad thing, that we're more cynical about what we're hearing?
Well, I think it's because there's just we're so more visible, and the critique can fill the pages and the airwaves. I think that's part of it. But I think there's another thing. I don't know that we teach about the importance of our parliamentary tradition in schools. And for that reason, when I was Speaker, I instituted a series of taking the Speaker's role into schools. People would write in and say, please come to our school, we'd like to debate a bill, and they'd make up a bill that they wanted, the kids, that they wanted to debate.
Great.
And then we'd arrive and we'd bring down a dispatch box and we'd bring a robe for the clerk and we'd bring the symbol of the mace, the symbol of when the Parliament's in session. And then they would play the roles. They would play the roles of Leader of the House and so on. They'd each get a role and speak. And they'd divide, and as we would in an ordinary Parliament. And I would preside as Speaker and talk to them about the importance of our parliamentary history and why it is so important that we have free speech and that in that Parliament things are debated strongly and you get strong points of view. I think that's very important.
Yeah, it hasn't helped that over the past 12 years we've lost so many Prime Ministers within their own parties and removing them for others to try and get ahead and win the next election. That hasn't been good for confidence in the system, confidence in the party system. Was some of those leadership challenges some of the most dramatic times that you have experienced in the House?
Yes, I guess when Gillard replaced Rudd just overnight, that was a shock to the Parliament. And I get it started a roller coaster of leadership changes, which ended up with the amazing spectacle of a socialist, Mr Turnbull, leading the Liberal Party, which was really quite a turn of events. But then I look back at history, and if you go right back to Federation, changing of Prime Ministers, about 6 every decade, it wasn't really such a remarkable thing. But it had, because we'd had Menzies there for 16 years, we'd had Hawke there for 13, we'd had Howard there for 11 or 12 years. It seemed all stable, and I think that's why it seemed to be such a dramatic event.
You two have had your own dramas. I guess you can't avoid it when you're in the House for 30 years, the longest-serving woman in the Parliament. Were you a victim of Bill Shorten's dirt unit, Bronwyn?
Well, I have been told that, but I did find him a curious person. Certainly I've read the dirt bit, but on one occasion he sent someone round from his office with a brooch which had come from Chloe for me to wear in the House because she'd noticed that I like to wear brooches.
Really?
And I found that quite extraordinary.
Quite touching.
So he is a very strange guy, I think.
Let's remind our viewers of Choppergate, which, of course, I thought you handled yourself with a great deal of dignity. Let's remind our viewers now.
Bronwyn Bishop is refusing to stand down as Speaker after hiring a helicopter to take her to a Liberal Party fundraiser.
She slugged taxpayers, I can't believe this, $5,000 to fly a helicopter from Melbourne to a Liberal fundraiser near Geelong, just 90 minutes away by road.
Mrs Bishop insists she was there on official business.
Well, the thing is, it was done within entitlement. The fact of the matter is I'm the guest speaker and I'm speaking about the Parliament and how it works, and that's what I do.
Bronwyn, are you over all of that? Are you still dirty about it? Do you think you could have served for another 10 years?
I'm sure I could have served for a longer period, but that wasn't the way it was going to be. But I decided in that, first of all, I paid the money because I saw that the cost of it was what I thought was more expensive. And I didn't book the helicopter. That's not what you do. You have staff and people who book helicopters.
That's right.
And it was a legitimate thing to do in the circumstances. And there were, believe me, plenty of other ministers who'd used helicopters. But I decided I wasn't going to dump on people as I'd been dumped on. I thought it was better to just say that this is what I'm doing. And then when Tony asked me to resign from the Speakers, well, that's what I did.
Tell me about your relationship with Tony Abbott today.
It's a good relationship. It's when you've known someone for as long as I've known him and he's known me, I think we referred to it as dirty water under the bridge, and so we have a good relationship.
I mentioned about changing Prime Ministers, etc. What will be the legacy of Malcolm Turnbull in the Liberal Party?
Destructive. I mean, he was determined to be Prime Minister by hook or by crook. I often think that, you know, when he ran the Republic debate, he really wanted to be the first president. And when he couldn't get that, he was going to be Prime Minister. So
he still might want to be President, Bronwyn.
He probably does. But, I mean, I think all those stories about him, which are quite verified about him wanting to be in the Labor Party, were quite true. I think he would have been happier there.
And we're seeing...
But they didn't want him. I think they saw it was trouble.
That's right. Richo said, no, thank you very much, Malcolm, but go away. We're seeing his true colours post-politics, aren't we?
Yes, well, I think he reveals a lot about himself, and that's his choice. But people see it for what it is.
Right now, we're having a rather hefty discussion about our reliance on China. Now, you have a great deal of extensive experience dealing with the Chinese government. What have you learnt over the decades about the trust we should have in that regime?
Well, we can't trust it. It is the Communist Party of China. And just remember its origins. You know, when Mao Zedong took power in 1949, the first act was to eliminate the power of the landlord. And he killed about 1 in 4 of all landlords. They still don't know how many he might have killed then. Could have been 2 million. And then, of course, in the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward in 1959, it took decades to find out that he starved 43 million Chinese people to death.
Yeah.
And then in the Cultural Revolution, there were millions more that were killed. We will never know how many people have died of the virus out of Wuhan for, I would reckon, another decade before we start to see just what the death toll has been. And then for it to be deliberately shipped out into the rest of the world by closing down internal airlines and by sending overseas airlines full of people carrying that virus, that's how it spread to the rest of the world.
They've been so aggressive, so defensive, the Chinese, about the source of this, and our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, having the temerity to ask for an independent inquiry into the origin. I can't think that there is any, not even one single argument against that idea. Do you get the impression there's a little bit more to it than what we even suspect?
I think there could well be, but it'll take a long time to find out. But it is important to take a stand and say we want answers, because it could happen again.
Yeah.
I mean, this virus, which is called all sorts of names, we've got an outbreak in Australia at the moment, I think, of Ross River fever. Why do we call it that? Because it came from Ross River. This virus came from Wuhan, and it should be called the Wuhan virus. But the point is that it is really a near cousin of SARS, which, of course, was around in 2002. Now, we haven't got a vaccine for that, and that's been 2 decades ago. So we have to make sure that there's not going to be another one on its way.
And if there is, we've got to be in a position, don't we, to be able to look after ourselves medically in terms of health facilities. We are not prepared. We've learned some lessons out of this, haven't we?
Yes, we have. And that means that we have to have the capability to make our testing equipment, our masks, our surgical needs, our ventilators, all of those things need to be made here. Because when you look at what has happened, the diplomatic arm of the Communist Party of China went out and tried to say, well, it didn't come from us, it came from somewhere else, but look, we're here to help, and we'll be supplying you with masks and ventilators and tests and so on. But the countries have built it, most notably Spain, for instance, has bought 400,000 masks and testing kits, and had to, and they were all distributed defective.
Yeah.
People have found masks that actually had the virus contaminant in it. You know, we cannot, and this latest lot that the taxpayer paid was thought to be a philanthropic gesture on behalf of Mr. Forrest, and turned out the taxpayer was paying for it. I wonder how good that product's going to be.
It's a good question. We need to be in a position to supply our own masks next time, and let's hope there's no next time.